Okay, getting ready for the STAAR. We're on TEK A-8A, which is about solving quadratics. There are two types. First is the kind you can solve by square rooting. And the second is the kind that you have to factor. We do remember that you can have a little workaround for either of these types. You can either graph it in your calculator, in which case you look to see where the roots are, and if it's not in the window, you change the window of the calculator. Or second, you can plug in your answer choices. Alright, taking a look at this first problem, we see that we can square root it. It only has a regular x, or the exponent there. It doesn't have an x squared and that, so we square root. The square root will cancel with the exponent. We're left with x plus 7 equals. The square root of 81 is positive or negative 9, because positive 9 times itself is 81, but also a negative 9 times a negative 9 is equal to a positive 81. Then we want to get the x on its own, so we subtract 7, the inverse operation, to get rid of the positive 7. And we're left with x is equal to both a positive 9 minus 7 and x is equal to a negative 9 minus 7. 9 minus 7 is equal to 2. Negative 9 minus 7 is equal to negative 16. The answer is J. Moving on to the next question, we see that the equation has both a w squared and a regular w, so it's not square rootable. We would need to factor it. I'm going to leave space on this side to do the other option, which would be to plug in your answer choices, but let's go ahead and factor. I'll rewrite it, w squared plus 6w minus 112. So we like to organize it in the x factor. We multiply the a term times the c term. 1 times negative 112 is negative 112. And we put the b term at the bottom. And then we ask the question, what two numbers multiply to give us negative 112 and add or subtract to give us a positive 6? You can do some trial and error in your calculator, and you would find that 8 and 14 are the two factors. Since it is a negative 112, we know that only one of them can be negative and needs to be negative. They can't both be positive, or it wouldn't give us a negative 112, and they can't both be negative, or it would also give us a positive 112. So the question is, which one would have to be negative in order that when we add them, we're left with a positive? Well, the smaller number, 8, would be negative. So then we factor. How did we get w squared, w, and then the two factors that we came up with, the numbers, we came up with negative 8 and positive 14. So those are the two factors, the two binomials that multiply to give us that previous trinomial when we distribute all the way through. Alright, and then to take it to the final step, we set both of these equal to 0 in order to solve for the roots, the solutions. W plus 14 is equal to 0. To get rid of that minus 8, we add 8, W is equal to 8, or minus 14, W is equal to negative 14. Since we are talking about the width of a trampoline, it would not make sense to have a negative number, so the answer is W is equal to 8, which is C. Just to show, you can also, if you are uncomfortable doing the factoring, which hopefully you are pretty good at, but if you would prefer to plug in, you certainly can. You would take your calculator and write that equation, w squared, except instead of w, we would plug in our answer choices. You'd probably start at A and work your way down, but we know the answer is C, so let's go ahead and start there. So we have 8 squared. Every time I plug it in, I put parentheses, and then the equation goes plus 6w, but instead of the w, we'll put our answer, minus 112. So we wrote the equation, we hit enter, and it does indeed give us 0. If we were to plug in those other numbers in the equation, it would not work out. So plugging in the calculator also gives you the answer. Alright, next question. We see it has both an x squared and an x, so we're not going to be able to use the square root method, so we would need to factor it again. I'm going to leave space again on the left side for plugging in. (2x squared minus 6x), and it's supposed to equal 416. In order to factor it, we would need it in standard form, so we get rid of this. Minus 416 minus 416. 2x squared minus 6x minus 416 is equal to 0. We would try and do the x factor, multiply the first term times the last term, and get 832. Put the c term at the bottom, that's negative 6. And here's an example where we have a very large number. We're coming up with all the factors, and we want the ones that are going to give us a difference of negative 6. And you can see that would be rather cumbersome, possible, but cumbersome. And so that's why some students prefer the plug-in method. So we would take that equation, 2x squared minus 6x, and we'd plug in our answer choices to try and get to the right one. Let's start with D. We'd put 2 times 16 squared minus 6 times 16. And we could plug that in our calculator. 2 parentheses 16 close parentheses squared minus 6 parentheses 16. So we've just plugged it in, we hit enter, and we see that it gives us the answer 416 like it asked for in the question. So D is the answer. Moving on to number 8, we see that there's just an x squared, not both an x squared and an x, so we can use the square root method. We have 1/3 x squared minus 3 is equal to 0. You can leave the equal 0 on the other side, it wouldn't matter. We want the x squared on its own, so we do the inverse to get rid of the minus 3. We add 3 on both sides. 1/3 x squared is equal to 3. To get rid of the fraction, 1/3 it's currently dividing by 3. When you cut something into a third, you're dividing by 3. To get rid of that, we multiply by 3. If we do it to one side, we have to do it to both. X squared is equal to 9. To get rid of the squared, the exponent of 2, we square root both sides. Those cancel. X is equal to positive or negative 3. We see that the question was asking for just the positive, so the answer is positive 3. Next question. It has both an n squared and an n, so we're going to need to factor it. I'm going to leave space on the left because you can also plug in like we've been saying. So we have n squared plus n, and that is supposed to give us 156. In order to factor it, we'd go minus 156 minus 156. N squared plus n minus 156 is equal to 0. And we do our x factor. 156 at the top, 1 at the bottom. We're looking for those factors, or of course you can do your plugging in, n squared plus n, and see which one is going to be equal to 156. We can plug in our answer choices. I'm going to start with J. 12 squared plus 12. It is indeed 156. That is the answer. The next problem, which was number 29 on the 2016 test, we can square root it, and before we square root it, we would divide by 2 on both sides. That leaves us with x minus 7 squared equals 16. Then, to get rid of the square root, we get rid of the square by square rooting. X minus 7 is equal to, the square root of 16 is positive or negative 4. We do the inverse to get rid of minus 7. We add 7, x is equal to both a positive 4 plus 7, and x is equal to a negative 4 plus 7. X is equal to 11, and x is equal to 3. The answer is C. This question has a t squared only, not also a regular t, so we can use the square root method again. It tells us that the length is equal to 30, so we can plug in 30. 30 is equal to 0.8 t squared. Right now it's 0.8 times t. We need to get that t on its own, so we square. And that was the phone. I've lost my track of mind. We need to divide by 0.8 to get rid of that 0.8. If we do it on one side, we have to do it on both sides. T squared is equal to 30 divided by 0.8 is 37.5. 37.5. We square root both sides. T is equal to the square root of 37.5 is equal to 6.12, positive or negative. Since we're talking about lengths and time, it does not make sense to have a negative, so it would just be the positive 6.1, J. And the last question, we see that it has an x squared and an x, so we would not be able to do the square root method. We would need to factor it. We would get the 18 to the other side. 3x squared plus 15x minus 18. If we start to do the x factor, we multiply 3 times 18 and put that on top. We put the b term, the middle term, on bottom. We ask what two numbers multiply and add to do. But as we've seen from previously, we can also plug in the answer choices, and it could look something like this: 3 parentheses squared plus 15 parentheses, and see which of those equals 18 as the answer, and B is the answer in there. Alright, that is how to solve quadratics for the STAAR A.8A.